I inherited an abandoned beach cabin from my wife, and my son got the historic villa in Italy. He sneered, "Go live with the rats, old man," and kicked me out of the home I built. I drove through the night just to find a spot to rest, but when I forced that rotting door open, my breath caught at what I saw. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy black plastic trash bag hit the gravel driveway with a sickening thud. The plastic tore open on a sharp stone, spilling a gray wool sweater and a handful of my socks into the dirt. I stared at the clothes, then slowly raised my eyes to my son. Cameron stood on the porch of the home I had paid for over 40 years, his arms crossed over his tailored designer suit. Beside him, leaning against the freshly painted doorframe, his wife Natalie was casually inspecting her manicured nails, utterly indifferent to the fact that they were throwing a 70-year-old man onto the street. The reading of Evelyn's will had concluded exactly 3 hours ago. The attorney had handed Cameron the primary estate and the crown jewel of my late wife's assets, a historic sprawling villa in the Italian countryside. I, her husband of 45 years, was handed a single yellowed deed to an off-grid beach cabin on the desolate Oregon coast. It was a property Evelyn had inherited decades ago and had not mentioned since. Cameron had wasted no time. The moment the lawyer left, he marched up to my bedroom, bagged up the few garments I had not yet packed, and dragged them out the front door. "Go live with the rats, old man," Cameron sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "The Italian property is mine. The firm is mine. This house is mine. You have 10 minutes to get your truck off my property before I call a tow company and have it impounded." I did not yell. I did not raise my hands or beg for a few more days to pack my life away. Screaming is the desperate refuge of the powerless, and I had spent 35 years as a forensic accountant. My entire career was built on dismantling corporate fraud, tracing hidden assets, and executing hostile liquidations. I knew what a finalized takeover looked like. I bent down, ignoring the sharp ache in my knees, gathered the spilled clothes and shoved them back into the torn plastic bag. For the past 3 years, while Evelyn withered away in the guest bedroom from aggressive pancreatic cancer, I had stepped away from everything to become her full-time caregiver. I administered her morphine. I bathed her. I held her hand through the agonizing nights. And while I was distracted by the sheer terror of losing my wife, Cameron had eagerly stepped into the vacuum. He took over the daily operations of Evelyn's logistics firm. He used his new proxy access to drain the operational accounts, redirecting company funds to lease imported sports cars, buy Natalie diamond tennis bracelets, and project the illusion of massive self-made wealth. I had seen the discrepancies in the bank statements a year ago, but I kept silent. I did not want Evelyn's final days tainted by the knowledge that her only son was a parasite actively bleeding her life's work dry. I threw the trash bag into the bed of my 15-year-old pickup truck. I did not look back at the porch. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and backed out of the driveway. The silence inside the cab was absolute. I merged onto the highway, pointing the truck west toward the coast. My phone remained dark in the passenger seat. There were no calls from Cameron checking if I had enough gas money. There were no messages from Natalie offering a hotel room for the night. They had successfully excised me from the family ledger, discarding me the second I was no longer a required utility. The drive took 6 hours. The paved highway eventually gave way to a treacherous, winding coastal road that clung to the edge of the cliffs. Dense, freezing fog rolled off the Pacific Ocean, obscuring the perilous drop-offs just a few feet from my tires. I navigated the switchbacks with rigid precision, the tires fighting for traction on the slick, unpaved gravel of the final access road. I arrived at the coordinates listed on the yellowed deed long past midnight. My headlights washed over a structure that looked ready to collapse into the sea. The cabin was a miserable, rotting silhouette against the black ocean. The cedar siding was eaten away by decades of salt and harsh wind. The windows were boarded up with decaying plywood. Blackberry brambles thick as barbed wire choked the front steps. It was exactly the kind of forgotten, worthless ruin Cameron assumed it to be. I parked the truck and grabbed a heavy iron tire wrench from beneath the passenger seat. The freezing ocean wind cut straight through my thin jacket as I pushed my way through the thorny overgrowth. I reached the front door. A massive rusted padlock secured a heavy iron chain across the timber frame. I raised the tire wrench and brought it down violently against the lock. The metal shrieked. I struck it again, the force jarring my shoulder until the rusted internal pins shattered and the padlock fell into the damp weeds. I pulled the chain free and kicked the heavy oak door open. I braced myself for the stench of black mold, dead animals, and decades of stagnant decay. Instead, a wave of perfectly dry temperature-controlled air hit my face. I stepped over the threshold, feeling for a light switch on the wall. I found a modern flush-mounted panel and pressed it. Rows of recessed LED lights instantly illuminated the space, and my breath caught in my throat. The interior of the rotting cabin had been entirely gutted and rebuilt. The wooden floorboards had been replaced with polished, reinforced concrete. Thick, insulated cabling ran along the ceiling, connecting to a massive humming climate control unit. Occupying the center of the vast room were 3 towering high-grade server racks, their cooling fans emitting a low, steady frequency. Blinking green and blue data lights illuminated the dark corners of the room. This was not an abandoned shack. It was a fully operational off-grid data center. My forensic instincts instantly overrode my exhaustion. I walked past the humming servers, tracing the thick power conduits along the floor. They disappeared into a solid wall at the back of the cabin. The wall was paneled in seamless cedar designed to look like a structural boundary, but the airflow patterns in the dust along the baseboard indicated a hollow space behind it. I ran my hands along the wood grain until my fingers brushed against a smooth glass, like square completely flush with the paneling. A biometric scanner. I pressed my right thumb against the glass. A microscopic red laser scanned my print. The scanner beeped, flashing green. A heavy mechanical latch disengaged with a loud clack, and a section of the wall silently slid backward, revealing a fortified steel vault door. I pushed it open and stepped into a small, windowless room. The vault contained a pristine steel desk, a leather chair, a thick, leather-bound ledger, and a single laptop computer. Inserted into the laptop was a red encrypted flash drive. I sat in the chair, opened the laptop, and tapped the spacebar. The screen woke up instantly. A single video file sat on the desktop titled "For Gordon." I clicked the file. The media player launched, and Evelyn's face appeared on the screen. She looked frail, her cheekbones sharp and hollowed by the cancer, but her eyes possessed a terrifying, ruthless clarity I had not seen since her early days building her company. "Hello, Gordon." Her recorded voice echoed in the cold, steel room. "If you are watching this, it means I am gone. The will has been read, and our son has shown you exactly who he is. I know he kicked you out. I know he chose the Italian villa. I designed the will to ensure he would take the bait." I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Cameron believes he inherited an empire." Evelyn continued, a cold, hard smile touching her pale lips. "But the Italian villa is a financial landmine. I heavily leveraged that property 5 years ago. It harbors $3 million in hidden tax liens from the Italian Revenue Agency, along with severe structural condemnations that require immediate mandatory remediation. By accepting the deed, Cameron legally accepted the liabilities. The Italian authorities have been monitoring the estate. Tomorrow morning, they will execute the liens and freeze every domestic and international account tied to his name. The moment he signed that paper, he bankrupted himself. My mind raced, the forensic accountant in me instantly calculating the magnitude of the trap she had set. Evelyn had weaponized her own legacy. "This cabin," she said, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding register, "sits directly on top of my actual liquidated fortune. $15 million in untraceable offshore bearer bonds and physical gold bullion. It is secured beneath the floorboards of this vault. The servers outside are running automated algorithms legally transferring the remaining clean assets of my firm into ghost accounts only you can access via the ledger on that desk. I looked down at the heavy leather ledger resting inches from my hand. I knew Cameron was embezzling from my firm, Gordon. I knew he was draining the accounts to fund his wife's pathetic socialite fantasies while you were busy keeping me alive. I gathered the evidence. I built this fail-safe. When the Italian authorities freeze his accounts tomorrow, his fake lifestyle will instantly collapse. His creditors will demand payment. The contractors he hired with stolen money will turn on him. He will panic. And when he realizes he has no liquidity, he will inevitably come for the beach cabin. He will try to force you to sell it to bail him out. Evelyn paused, leaning closer to the camera, her eyes boring directly into mine through the digital screen. Do not yield an inch to him, Gordon. He is a parasite. He used my illness to steal from us, and he discarded you the second I stopped breathing. Let the trap close around him. Destroy him, Gordon. The screen cut to black. The low hum of the servers outside vibrated through the concrete floor. I sat in the silent vault staring at my reflection in the dark monitor. My son had thrown me away like garbage, assuming I was a weak, grieving old man who would simply disappear into the shadows. He had no idea that he had just handed a $15 million war chest to a forensic accountant with nothing left to lose. I reached out, pulled the heavy ledger toward me, and opened the first page. The heavy leather ledger sat open on the pristine steel desk. My finger traced the columns of blue ink, matching them to the digital routing numbers on the glowing monitor in front of me. 35 years of forensic auditing had trained my eyes to catch anomalies in seconds. I had spent my entire professional life dissecting corporate fraud tracking, hidden assets, and executing hostile liquidations for massive firms. I knew what financial deception looked like down to the microscopic level. But Evelyn had not left me mere anomalies. She had left me a perfectly documented, irrefutable map of our son's thievery. I cross-referenced the dates in the ledger with the banking software on the laptop. 3 years ago, while I was holding my wife's frail hand through her first round of aggressive chemotherapy, Cameron had authorized a Shell Corporation payout of $200,000. While I was arranging her home hospice care, sleeping on a narrow cot beside her medical bed and listening to the agonizing rattle of her breathing, another $400,000 vanished into a luxury car dealership account. The numbers staring back at me were not just evidence of theft. They were a profound, agonizing insult to the very concept of family. Cameron had weaponized his mother's dying breaths. He used her suffering as a convenient smokescreen to bleed her logistics firm dry. He funneled the capital to project an illusion of massive self-made wealth to his elite social circle, buying the loyalty of people who would vanish the second the money stopped flowing. I turned the crisp page of the ledger, feeling the cool, recycled air of the hidden server farm wash over the back of my neck. I was calculating the exact total of his multi-year embezzlement when the sudden, harsh vibration of my cell phone shattered the absolute quiet of the vault. The caller identification flashed brightly on the screen. It was Cameron. It had been barely 24 hours since he stood on my front porch, crossed his arms over his tailored designer suit, and told me to get my truck off his property. I let the phone vibrate violently against the steel desk. I let it ring 4 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted the silence on my end to stretch his frayed nerves to the absolute breaking point. On the 5th ring, I picked up the device and pressed the green button. I brought the phone to my ear. I did not say a single word. I simply waited. "Dad!" The voice on the other end was breathless, completely stripped of all the smug arrogance he had displayed in the driveway yesterday afternoon. "Dad, are you there? Listen to me right now. Something is wrong. Something is completely wrong." I could hear him pacing frantically. The rapid, heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes echoed against hardwood floors. The Italian Revenue Agency just flagged the villa. They did not just flag it, they issued a total asset freeze. My domestic accounts, my business lines, my personal checking, everything is locked. They are claiming there are $3 million in unpaid back taxes and mandatory structural liens tied directly to the deed. I kept my breathing slow and steady, staring at Evelyn's neat handwriting in the ledger. Her trap had snapped shut with terrifying, beautiful precision. Cameron had coveted that historic villa his entire adult life, blinded by the prestige and the status it promised. He never bothered to look beneath the surface. He never ordered an independent audit of the gift before accepting it. He simply took it, assuming he was untouchable, assuming he had won the grand prize. By signing that deed, he had legally accepted all of its massive hidden liabilities. The moment he put pen to paper, he bankrupted himself. Now the overwhelming weight of his uncontrolled greed was crushing him. In the background of the call, I could hear Natalie's shrill, panicked voice piercing through the audio. "Tell him to fix it," she screamed, her words entirely lacking their usual polished grace. "Tell him we have contractors demanding payment right now." Her manicured claws were finally slipping. The counterfeit lifestyle they had built on stolen money was evaporating in real time. The credit cards were declining. The illusion was utterly dead. "Dad, say something." Cameron yelled, his panic twisting into ugly, desperate rage. "I need liquidity. Right now. My lawyer says the international freeze could last months. You need to sell the Oregon cabin. Today. I do not care how fast you have to move it. It is oceanfront property. Call a commercial broker, slash the asking price by 30% for a cash buyer, and wire the funds to my offshore account by tomorrow morning." I looked at the thick concrete walls of the vault surrounding me. I looked at the massive server racks just outside the door, quietly hiding $15 million in untraceable bonds and physical gold bullion. I looked at the ledger documenting his ultimate betrayal. He thought the cabin was a rotting, worthless shack yesterday, fit only for pests. Today it was his only perceived lifeline. He still believed he was in control. He still believed I was the obedient, grieving father who would sacrifice my last remaining asset to save him from his own incompetence. "Did you hear me?" Cameron demanded, his voice cracking under the mounting pressure. "If you do not sign that deed over, we lose the house. We lose the firm. You owe me this money. You abandoned the business to play nursemaid for 3 years while I kept everything afloat. You owe me this cash. Sign the property over to me right now, or so help me, I will call Adult Protective Services. I will tell a judge the grief has destroyed your mind. I will have you declared mentally unfit and throw you in a state ward to rot. I will take the cabin legally if you do not hand it over voluntarily." His breathing was ragged over the speaker. He was waiting for my compliance. He was waiting for the tired, grieving old man to submit just exactly as I had submitted to his eviction order yesterday. He expected me to prioritize his financial survival over my own dignity. He expected me to fold under the threat of institutionalization. He had entirely miscalculated the man he was threatening. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. "I am living with the rats, Cameron," I said, keeping my voice dead and hollow. "Rats do not sign deeds." I pulled the phone away from my ear as he started to scream my name. I pressed the end call button, cutting off his frantic voice mid-sentence. I did not just turn the phone off. I pressed my thumb hard against the plastic casing, popped the back panel open, and ripped the lithium battery out of the device. I tossed the dead phone and the battery into the metal wastebasket beside the steel desk. The silence returned to the vault, heavy and absolute. But it was no longer a peaceful silence. It was the calculated calm before the inevitable breach. Cameron was cornered, broke, and entirely desperate. The verbal threats were exhausted. He would not stop at a simple phone call. He would send people to take what he believed was his. The conflict was about to escalate from words to physical violence. I closed the leather ledger, stood up from the desk, and turned toward the glowing security monitors mounted on the wall. The real war was about to begin. The battery hit the bottom of the metal wastebasket with a dull clink. I did not waste time savoring the silence. Cameron was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals did not sit still. He was a coward, which meant he would not make the 6-hour drive himself. He would send proxies, someone cheap, fast, and desperate for the cash, Cameron could no longer pay them. I turned my attention to the main console mounted beside the heavy vault door. A series of dark screens lined the wall above it. I typed in the master passcode Evelyn had left on the desk. The monitors flared to life one by one. Infrared camera feeds illuminated the overgrown driveway, the treacherous cliffside drop, and the winding gravel road leading to the property. The perimeter was secure, but the isolation was a double-edged sword. No one could hear a scream out here, which was exactly what Cameron was counting on. I reached beneath the console and engaged the exterior lockdown protocol. Heavy steel shutters, hidden seamlessly within the cedar siding, slammed down over the reinforced windows. The cabin was now a fortress. Let them come. I sat back down in the leather chair and pulled Evelyn's heavy ledger toward me. The leather was worn softened by the countless hours she must have spent sitting in this exact spot while her body failed her. I opened the cover. Rows of meticulously handwritten numbers filled the pages matched with corresponding digital transaction hashes. I cracked my knuckles, letting 35 years of forensic auditing muscle memory take over. My eyes darted across the columns, instantly recognizing the familiar rhythm of financial deception. Cameron had not been particularly clever. He had simply been arrogant. I traced the first anomaly: a logistics contract assigned to a vendor based out of Delaware. The billing address was a registered Dropbox. I cross-referenced the employer identification number with the server database Evelyn had compiled. The company was owned by a blind trust registered to Natalie's maiden name. My son had used his wife's family as a shield to siphon $300,000 in a single quarter. I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest, not from surprise, but from a profound clinical disgust. Years ago, when Cameron was just starting college, I sat with him at our kitchen table and explained how phantom vendor schemes worked. I taught him how to spot them to protect the family business. I never imagined I was giving him an instruction manual. Page after page, the theft became more brazen. He had drained the company pension fund reserves to cover the down payment on a luxury yacht. He had forged Evelyn's signature on a series of short-term high-interest corporate loans to mask the missing operational capital. Every stolen dollar was converted into the counterfeit lifestyle he flaunted in front of our faces. While Evelyn was throwing up her meals from the chemotherapy, Cameron was routing $50,000 to a private country club membership. He bled his dying mother dry to buy the illusion of importance. I did not let anger blur my vision. Anger makes you sloppy. I opened a new file on the secure laptop and began extracting the data. I pulled the routing numbers, the forged digital signatures, the offshore wire confirmations. I linked every stolen cent directly to the internet protocol addresses of Cameron's personal devices. I built a digital dossier so utterly bulletproof that a first-year law student could use it to secure a federal indictment. I categorized the crimes: wire fraud, embezzlement, forgery, elder financial exploitation. The total sum of his theft hovered just over $2.4 million. I attached Evelyn's video confession as the primary exhibit. I encrypted the entire package into a single lethal file. I named it simply the Ledger. This was no longer just about protecting my inheritance. This was about executing a total, irreversible liquidation of Cameron's life. He had discarded me because he thought I was a fragile, useless old man. He forgot that before I was a grieving husband, I was the man corporations called to destroy their enemies. I tapped the keyboard, uploading a copy of the dossier to a secure cloud server completely detached from the cabin's network. If anything happened to me tonight, the file was programmed to automatically forward to federal authorities and every major news outlet in the city. The progress bar on the screen hit 100%. The trap was fully loaded. I reached for the glass of water on the desk, taking a slow sip. The silence of the vault was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the cooling fans. Then a sharp electronic chime echoed from the security console. I turned my head. On the top left monitor, 2 points of bright white light pierced the freezing coastal fog. Headlights. A pair of heavy, unmarked sport utility vehicles were aggressively navigating the final switchback of the gravel road, heading straight for the cabin. Cameron had not waited for the morning. He had sent his cleaners under the cover of darkness. I watched the vehicles tear through the overgrown blackberry bushes and skid to a halt in my driveway. 4 massive men stepped out into the freezing rain carrying heavy steel crowbars. The audit was over. The physical war had arrived. The heavy gravel crunched beneath the tires of the 2 approaching vehicles. Through the glow of the infrared security monitors, I watched the unmarked black SUVs cut their headlights long before they reached the top of the driveway. They were trying to be stealthy. They thought they were creeping up on a frail, isolated old man sitting in a rotting wooden shack. They had no idea they were walking into a digital fortress. 4 men stepped out into the freezing coastal rain. Even through the grainy green filter of the night vision cameras, I instantly recognized the man leading the pack. It was Trent. He was Natalie's older brother, a failed real estate flipper and unlicensed contractor who made his living skimming off the top of cheap renovations. Cameron despised Trent, always mocking his cheap suits and sleazy business practices behind his back. But desperation makes for strange bedfellows. Cameron was completely out of cash, and his bank accounts were frozen by the Italian authorities. He could not afford to hire professionals. He had to rely on his wife's bottom-feeding brother to do his dirty work. Trent pulled a massive steel crowbar from the trunk of the first SUV. The 3 men behind him were heavy-set hired muscle carrying sledgehammers and heavy-duty chains. They walked toward the front porch with the swagger of men who expected zero resistance. They were here to drag me out into the cold, secure the property, and change the locks so Cameron could force a fire sale by morning. I did not reach for the phone to call the police. Calling the authorities would only result in a messy trespassing charge, a minor inconvenience that Cameron's high-priced lawyers would tie up in court for years. I did not want to delay my son. I wanted to break him. I turned my chair away from the security feeds and opened the secondary laptop sitting on the corner of the steel desk. It was a dedicated decryption terminal Evelyn had used to secure her logistics networks. I did not need military-grade software to breach my son's digital life. 30 years of auditing corporate fraud had taught me that human arrogance is always the weakest link in any security system. When Cameron took over his mother's firm, he had insisted on migrating all of her secure files to his own personal cloud server, because he thought he knew better than the expensive cybersecurity team she had employed. I typed in the web address for his primary cloud portal. The password prompt blinked on the screen. Cameron was a man governed entirely by his own ego. He never updated his credentials. He used the exact same variation of his college fraternity letters and his birth year for everything. I typed the sequence in. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before granting me total administrative access to his entire digital footprint. I bypassed his financial folders. I already had the ledger proving he had stolen over $2 million from his dying mother. I needed something far more immediate. I accessed his synchronized mobile backups and pulled up his call logs from the past hour. The data synchronization was active, meaning every phone call he made through his internet provider was automatically recorded and uploaded to the cloud for his business records. It was a lazy, arrogant feature he used to keep tabs on his employees. Tonight, it was going to be his undoing. I found an audio file generated exactly 12 minutes after I had removed the battery from my own phone. The outgoing number belonged to Trent. I downloaded the file, routed the audio through the cabin's primary sound system, and put on a pair of studio headphones. I pressed play. Cameron's voice filled my ears, shaking with a frantic, unhinged rage. "Listen to me, Trent." The old man hung up on me. He is completely disconnected. He thinks he can sit in that worthless shack and ignore me while my entire life burns down. Get up there right now. Break the door down. I do not care if you have to drag him out by his collar and leave him on the side of the highway. Just get him out of there. I need that property empty so I can list it by sunrise. You do this for me, and I will give you 20% of the sale. Do whatever it takes to remove him. I paused the recording. A cold, mechanical calm settled over my chest. My own son had just authorized a violent assault against me. He had put a bounty on my physical safety to cover up his own financial crimes. The last lingering shred of paternal hesitation I held onto completely evaporated. I saved the audio file and dragged it into the cabin's exterior public address interface. Outside on the monitors, Trent and his hired thugs marched up the wooden steps of the front porch. Trent raised his crowbar and smashed it against the wooden frame of the door. The loud, hollow thud echoed through the external microphones. Trent laughed, thinking the rotting cedar was going to give way with a single strike. "Come on out, Gordon," Trent shouted, his voice dripping with sleazy confidence. "Cameron sent us to help you pack. You do not want to make this hard on yourself. It is freezing out here. Just open the door, hand over the keys, and maybe we will give you a ride to the nearest bus station. Otherwise, we are going to tear this place down around your ears." I watched him motion to the largest of the three thugs. The man stepped forward, hefting a 10-pound sledgehammer over his shoulder. He took a wide stance, swung the hammer in a massive arc, and brought it down directly on the center of the door. The impact was deafening, but the door did not splinter. It did not even dent. The rotting cedar exterior was just a cosmetic facade. Directly beneath it was a 3-inch thick plate of solid ballistics-grade steel reinforced by titanium crossbeams. The shockwave of the blow ricocheted straight back up the wooden handle of the sledgehammer. The thug cried out in pain, dropping the tool as the vibrations shattered the bones in his right wrist. Trent stared at the unyielding door in absolute confusion. He stepped back, raising his flashlight to inspect the frame. That was my cue. I reached across the console and flipped a row of heavy red toggles. A harsh mechanical grinding noise erupted from the roofline of the cabin. Trent and his men looked up in terror as thick, heavy-gauge security shutters deployed from the hidden eaves. The titanium panels slammed down over the windows and the porch perimeter locking perfectly into the concrete foundation. Before Trent could process what was happening, I triggered the secondary perimeter defense. The heavy steel gate at the bottom of the gravel driveway, which they had pushed open upon arrival, automatically slammed shut and locked magnetically. The two unmarked SUVs were now trapped inside the compound. They were locked in a cage with no exit. Panic immediately set in. The thugs realized this was not a simple eviction of a helpless old man. They were dealing with a fortified compound. Trent backed away from the porch, his crowbar trembling in his hands. I leaned into the microphone on my desk and flipped the public address switch. My voice boomed out of the high-fidelity weatherproof speakers mounted in the trees surrounding the property. The sound was deafening, cutting through the howling ocean wind. "Good evening, Trent," I announced. "I assure you the police are not coming. I have no interest in involving the authorities in a simple family dispute. However, I want to make sure your associates understand exactly who they are working for before they spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for armed invasion and elder assault." I clicked the mouse on my laptop. The recording of Cameron's frantic phone call blasted through the forest. "Break the door down." Cameron's voice echoed through the trees, clear and unmistakable. "I do not care if you have to drag him out by his collar and leave him on the side of the highway. You do this for me, and I will give you 20% of the sale. Do whatever it takes." The three hired thugs stared at Trent. They were career criminals, not fools. They recognized immediately that they had just been recorded, participating in a highly illegal premeditated assault against a vulnerable target, orchestrated by a man who had left a massive digital paper trail. There was no deniability. The audio proved they were acting as hired mercenaries for a targeted hit. "We are not going down for this," the injured thug shouted, clutching his broken wrist. "You said this was a simple lockout. You did not say the old man had the place rigged like a military bunker." The three men turned and sprinted toward the SUVs. They scrambled into the vehicles, completely ignoring Trent's desperate pleas for them to stay. The driver of the lead SUV threw the car into reverse, slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and crashed the heavy vehicle directly through the locked steel gate at the bottom of the driveway. The metal shrieked and gave way, buckling under the weight of the truck. The second SUV followed instantly, leaving a cloud of exhaust and flying gravel in their wake. Trent was left standing completely alone in the freezing rain. He looked at the shattered gate, then turned back toward the unblinking eye of the security camera mounted above the porch. "Tell Cameron his 20% is worthless," I broadcasted through the speakers, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "Tell him his mother left me everything. Tell him I have the ledger. And tell him I will see him on Friday." Trent dropped his crowbar into the mud. He turned and began a long, humiliating walk down the dark, treacherous coastal highway on foot. I turned off the microphone. The physical threat was neutralized, completely broken, without me ever having to leave the leather chair in the vault. Cameron had thrown his most violent option at me, and it had crumbled against the fortress Evelyn had built. But I knew Cameron well enough to understand that the panic would only deepen. When Trent called him from the side of that dark road and relayed my message about the ledger, Cameron would realize his financial crimes were fully exposed. He would realize the inheritance he stole was poisoned, and the fortune he desired was locked behind a wall he could never breach. He was going to try and negotiate. He would attempt to use his wife, his social standing, and his high-priced corporate lawyers to crush me in a boardroom. He would invite me into his domain to force a surrender. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock folder. I began organizing the printed pages of the digital dossier. Cameron wanted a corporate war. I was going to give him a public execution. I stood up, turned off the vault monitors, and prepared to drive back into the city. It was time to arrange the ambush. The coastal fog was just beginning to burn off as I locked the heavy steel vault door behind me. The cabin exterior was still secured beneath its titanium shutters, an impenetrable shell sitting quietly against the roar of the Pacific Ocean. I did not bother checking the driveway. I knew the shattered remnants of the iron gate were the only proof that my son had tried to use brute force to erase me. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the heavy leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, a steady, reliable sound that contrasted sharply with the absolute chaos I was about to unleash. The drive into the city took just over 4 hours. I watched the dense pine forests give way to the sprawling concrete arteries of the metropolitan district. I did not turn on the radio. I did not need the distraction of noise. My mind was perfectly still, aligning the final pieces of Evelyn's masterful architecture. Cameron thought he was fighting a grieving widower. He did not realize he had picked a fight with a phantom, a man who had spent 35 years dismantling empires from the shadows. I parked the truck in a subterranean garage downtown, ignoring the stares of the corporate executives stepping out of their luxury sedans. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, tucked the leather portfolio under my arm, and walked toward the towering glass structure of the financial district. The offices of Wallace and Sterling occupied the entire top floor of the high-rise. It was an environment designed to intimidate. Polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, and an atmosphere of sterile, ruthless efficiency. Thomas Wallace was not a family lawyer. He did not handle divorces or petty civil disputes. He was a corporate litigator, a legal predator, who specialized in hostile takeovers, asset liquidations, and burying corporate criminals beneath mountains of inescapable federal indictments. I walked past the reception desk. The young assistant stood up to intercept me, offering a polite but firm smile, asking if I had an appointment. I did not stop walking. I told her to call Mr. Wallace and tell him Gordon Blake was walking into his office. The heavy mahogany doors to Wallace's inner sanctum were open. He was a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He was dictating something to an associate, but the moment he saw me standing in the doorway, the words died in his throat. He dismissed the associate with a sharp wave of his hand. Thomas Wallace owed his entire career to my late wife. 30 years ago, when he was a junior partner facing professional ruin from a fabricated corporate scandal, Evelyn had stepped in. She had hired me to audit the firm that was trying to frame him. I found the hidden accounts, exposed the real perpetrators, and cleared his name. Evelyn had given him his life back, and in return, he had sworn absolute loyalty to her. "Gordon," he said, stepping out from behind his massive desk. He looked at my worn clothes, then at the heavy portfolio under my arm. He knew immediately that this was not a social visit. He knew Evelyn had passed just days ago, and he knew the kind of man my son had become. He gestured to the leather chair across from him. "Sit down. Tell me what is happening." I sat down, the leather sighing beneath my weight. I did not offer small talk. I placed the portfolio on the polished mahogany surface and pushed it across the distance between us. "Evelyn left a fail-safe," I said, my voice completely flat. "Cameron took the Italian estate. He assumed the liabilities. The European revenue agencies froze his domestic accounts yesterday afternoon. He is entirely without liquidity." Wallace opened the portfolio, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the first page of the dossier I had compiled during the night. He adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from somber empathy to absolute predatory focus. He understood the legal implications of the Italian trap without needing an explanation. But that was just the prelude. "Look at the routing numbers," I told him. Wallace turned the page. The silence in the office deepened. I watched his eyes track across the columns of data I had extracted from Cameron's digital footprint. The phantom vendor payouts, the drained pension reserves, the forged corporate loans. The entire architecture of my son's multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme was laid bare on the paper. "Cameron has been bleeding Evelyn's logistics firm for 3 years. I continued, letting the cold reality of the numbers fill the room. He used her illness as a blind spot. He forged her digital signature on 24 separate occasions to mask the capital flight. The total sum is $2.4 million. Every cent is traced directly to the internet protocol addresses of his personal devices and the cloud network of his primary residence." Wallace did not say a word. He turned to the next section of the dossier where I had attached the transcriptions and audio files from the previous night. "When the asset freeze hit him, he panicked," I said. "He called me and demanded I sign over the deed to the coastal property. When I refused, he sent his brother-in-law with 3 hired men to break down the door and drag me out of the cabin." I handed Wallace a small digital drive containing the audio recording of Cameron authorizing the assault, along with the high-definition security footage of the thugs attempting to breach the titanium shutters with sledgehammers. I engaged the lockdown protocols I explained. The intruders were neutralized and fled the property. But the intent is documented. He offered a 20% commission on the sale of the cabin in exchange for my forcible removal. Wallace leaned back in his chair, taking his glasses off and letting them rest on the open folder. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated shock, quickly replaced by the cold calculation of a man evaluating a kill shot. He looked at me, studying my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of paternal weakness. He found none. Gordon Wallace began, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "What you have handed me is not a simple civil matter. The embezzlement alone constitutes federal wire fraud, aggravated corporate malfeasance, and elder financial exploitation. Adding the audio recording of him hiring Muscle to forcibly evict and assault you elevates this to a conspiracy charge." He tapped the thick stack of papers with his index finger. "The federal sentencing guidelines for this level of documented wire fraud carry a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The forgery and the conspiracy charges will add a mandatory minimum that a judge cannot waive. Cameron will not just lose the company, he will lose his freedom. He will be utterly destroyed." Wallace leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the mahogany desk. He needed to be absolutely certain I understood the gravity of the weapon I was handing him. He had seen families tear each other apart before, but he had never seen a father deliver a perfectly packaged, inescapable federal indictment against his own flesh and blood. "I am asking you this as your attorney, and as the man who owes your wife his life," Wallace said, holding my gaze. "What is the objective here? Are we using this as leverage to force him to surrender his remaining shares in the firm? Are we negotiating a quiet exit to keep him out of prison?" I stared back at the ruthless corporate litigator. I thought about the heavy black trash bag hitting the gravel driveway. I thought about Cameron sneering at me, telling me to go live with the rats, while my wife's ashes were barely cold. I thought about the sledgehammer striking the reinforced steel of the cabin door, a violent echo of my son's absolute lack of humanity. I did not feel anger. Anger is an unpredictable emotion that clouds judgment. I felt the profound, chilling clarity of a surgeon preparing to excise a malignant tumor. Cameron was not a son who had made a mistake. He was a parasite that had consumed his mother's legacy and attempted to devour my life the moment I stopped being useful to his illusion. Total, irreversible excision, I replied, my voice steady and hard as concrete. Wallace did not flinch. A slow, dark understanding settled over his features. He recognized the tone. It was the same tone Evelyn had used 30 years ago when she ordered me to dismantle the men who had tried to ruin him. The circle was completing itself. There will be no negotiations, I continued. There will be no quiet exit. He used my wife's dying breaths as a shield to steal her life's work. He sent men in the dead of night to throw me onto the street. He failed the stress test Evelyn built for him. He has proven that he is utterly devoid of redemption. I pointed to the digital drive resting on the desk. I want the accounts permanently locked. I want the authorities notified the exact second the trap springs. I am going to call him and offer a false surrender. I will tell him the cabin is unlivable, that I am scared, and that I am ready to sign over the deed to save him from his creditors. He is desperate and arrogant enough to take the bait without checking for the hook. Wallace picked up his pen, the professional predator inside him fully awakened. He knew exactly how to execute this maneuver. He had built his reputation on these precise moments of corporate slaughter. "Where do you want to spring the trap?" Wallace asked, writing a quick note on his legal pad. "He will want a public setting to assert his dominance," I said. "He will want me to feel small. He will likely arrange the meeting at his primary banking institution, surrounded by his remaining sycophants, and a notary to finalize the transfer of the deed and secure his imaginary lifeline. Then I will ensure the proper federal agents are waiting in the wings," Wallace said, his voice completely devoid of mercy. "I have contacts in the Financial Crimes Division who will move immediately when they see this dossier. They will not wait for a grand jury to secure an arrest warrant. The evidence of flight risk and ongoing criminal conspiracy is too severe. Prepare the trap for Friday," I instructed, standing up from the leather chair. "I will trigger the specific IRS flag needed to freeze his remaining credit lines in real time during the meeting. When he reaches for the pen to steal my home, I want him to realize he is signing his own prison sentence." Wallace closed the portfolio, resting his hand firmly on top of it. He looked up at me, a profound respect etched into his weathered face. "Evelyn would be proud of you, Gordon," he said quietly. "She knew exactly what kind of man you were. That is why she left the ledger to you." I nodded once, turning away from the polished mahogany desk. I walked out of the towering glass structure and back into the cold city air. The snare was set. The legal machinery was in motion. I took out my phone, inserted a fresh battery, and prepared to make the phone call that would lure my son to his own public execution. The silence was over. The masterstroke had begun. I sat in the cab of my truck, watching the city traffic flow around me. I dialed Cameron's number. It rang only twice before he answered, his breathing ragged, the panic from last night clearly having festered into absolute desperation. "Dad," he gasped. "Cameron," I said, allowing my voice to tremble slightly, injecting just enough fabricated exhaustion to make him believe I was broken. "The cabin. The men you sent. You were right. I cannot stay here. It is too cold. The wind is coming through the walls." I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end, the sound of a predator smelling blood. "I am tired, Cameron." I continued, staring at the sterile concrete of the parking garage. "I just want to rest. If I sign the deed over to you, will you arrange a place for me? A small apartment? A facility? Anything?" The trap was open. All he had to do was step inside. The cold leather of my truck seat groaned as I shifted my weight. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the windshield, blurring the neon lights of the financial district into smeared streaks of red and blue. Thomas Wallace was already moving his chess pieces behind the glass walls of his skyscraper, preparing the legal mechanisms that would inevitably crush my son. My part of the execution, however, required a different kind of precision. I reached into my thick coat pocket and pulled out the dead cell phone. I retrieved the lithium battery from the center console, snapping it back into the plastic casing. The screen flickered to life, glowing harshly in the dark cab of the truck. A cascade of missed call notifications flooded the display. 27 missed calls from Cameron. 14 text messages. The panic was bleeding through the digital screen, a frantic digital pulse of a man watching his counterfeit lifestyle crumble into absolute dust. Before I dialed his number, I needed to adjust my posture. A forensic accountant relies on cold, hard facts, but a father manipulating a greedy son relies on pure theater. I rolled my shoulders forward, letting my spine curve into a slump. I breathed in the damp air and forced a dry rasp into my throat. I had to sound like a man who had been broken by the coastal wind, terrified by the thugs who had just abandoned him, and utterly defeated by the weight of his own isolation. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, ensuring the cold predator in my eyes was thoroughly masked by the illusion of a tired, helpless victim. I pressed the call button. The line barely rang once before the connection clicked open. Cameron did not offer a greeting. His breathing was heavy, rapid, and aggressive. He demanded to know where I was and why I had disappeared. His voice carried the ragged edge of a man watching his empire burn to ash. I did not respond with anger. I let out a long, trembling sigh, leaning into the microphone so he could hear the fabricated exhaustion in my lungs. I told him I was still at the cabin. I let my voice crack perfectly, timing a slight stutter as I described the freezing draft coming through the floorboards. I told him about the men who had shown up in the dark. I lied and said they had terrified me, that I had hidden in the back room while they pounded on the door before they finally drove away. I painted a masterpiece of pathetic, shivering desperation, a picture of an old man who had suddenly realized he was completely outmatched by the brutal reality of the world. Cameron swallowed the lie instantly. His panic evaporated, replaced immediately by the arrogant sneer of a bully who thinks he has finally cornered his prey. I could hear the smug satisfaction radiating through the phone. He told me I was a fool for trying to hold out. He reminded me that the coastal property was rotting and useless to an old man with no income. He demanded to know if I was finally ready to stop playing games and sign the deed over to him so he could fix the disaster I had supposedly caused by being stubborn. I kept my voice small and hesitant. I told him I had nothing left. I reminded him that I had spent the last 3 years doing nothing but caring for his dying mother, entirely isolated from the financial realities of her business. It was a calculated reminder. I was drip-feeding his own arrogant assumptions right back to him. I knew Cameron believed I was financially illiterate simply because I never paraded my intelligence the way he did. When he wrecked his first sports car in college, I was the one who quietly handled the insurance adjusters and shielded him from the fallout. He always assumed I fixed things out of weakness rather than duty. Now I was weaponizing that exact assumption against him. I told Cameron I would give him the deed. I told him he could have the oceanfront property to liquidate and save himself from the Italian tax authorities. I only asked for one thing in return. I let a pathetic whine slip into my words as I begged him for a small monthly allowance. I asked for just enough to rent a modest apartment in a quiet suburb and buy my groceries, a completely insignificant sum that would secure his multi-million-dollar lifeline. I heard a sharp, cruel laugh echo in the background of the call. It was Natalie. She was standing close to him, listening to me beg. Her voice was shrill and dripping with absolute contempt. She told Cameron not to give me a single dime more than the absolute minimum required to put me in a state-run facility. She loudly mocked my supposed surrender, calling me a parasite who was trying to bleed them dry. She had spent the last 3 years spending money I had helped Evelyn secure, and now she was laughing at the thought of me eating canned soup in a sterile room. She told Cameron that I deserved to be left in the dirt. Cameron shushed her, but I could hear the smile in his voice. His greed was blinding him to every single red flag. A smart man would have questioned why a man who had locked down a property hours ago was suddenly surrendering without a fight. A smart man would have demanded to see the property himself. But Cameron was not smart. He was desperate, and my offer of a rapid, unresisting surrender was exactly the narcotic his ego demanded. The prospect of free money completely overwhelmed whatever basic survival instincts he possessed. He told me he generously accepted my terms. He promised to arrange a small monthly stipend, just as long as I signed the irrevocable transfer of the deed by the end of the week. He wanted to finalize the paperwork immediately before his creditors could completely dismember his remaining assets. He spoke with the unearned authority of a king dictating terms to a peasant, completely unaware that the throne he sat on was built entirely of matches. I asked him where he wanted to meet. I suggested we use a neutral lawyer, but Cameron immediately shot the idea down. He needed to be in control. He needed to humiliate me on his own territory. He demanded we meet at his primary banking institution downtown. He wanted his personal notary present, his bank manager as a witness, and the sterile, opulent environment of his financial stronghold to serve as the backdrop for my defeat. He told me to meet him in the executive boardroom on the top floor this coming Friday at noon. He warned me not to be late and told me to wear something that would not embarrass him in front of his associates. I told him I would be there. I thanked him profusely, letting my voice tremble with false gratitude. I told him he was a good son for taking care of me, despite everything that had happened. Cameron scoffed. He told me to just bring the deed and hung up the phone without another word. The line went dead. The artificial weakness instantly drained from my posture. I straightened my spine and rolled my neck, cracking the stiff joints. The performance was over. The bait had been taken entirely whole. Cameron and Natalie were so consumed by their own shallow narcissism that they had essentially built the gallows and eagerly placed their own heads inside the noose. They believed Friday would be a coronation. They believed they were going to walk into that boardroom, seize a multi-million-dollar asset, and cast me out into the gutter with a handful of pennies. They had absolutely no idea that Thomas Wallace was already coordinating with federal agents. They had no idea that the cabin they thought was their salvation did not even belong to me, but was locked inside an irrevocable blind trust the moment Evelyn drew her last breath. They thought they were dealing with a victim. They were actually dealing with their executioner. I started the engine of my truck. The heater blasted warm air over my cold hands. I put the vehicle into gear and drove out of the parking structure, blending seamlessly into the anonymous flow of the city traffic. Every piece on the board had been moved into the precise position required for total annihilation. I needed to liquidate a very specific portion of the hidden offshore bonds, just enough to trigger an automated Internal Revenue Service alert that Wallace would weaponize during the meeting. I also needed to purchase a new suit. Cameron had told me not to embarrass him. I fully intended to honor that request. I would arrive at his destruction looking completely immaculate. The rain continued to fall, washing the city streets clean as I drove toward the financial center. The smoldering conflict had finally ignited into an uncontrollable blaze, but Cameron still thought he was holding the matches. The entire narrative of his life was about to be violently rewritten, and the silence I had maintained for years was about to become the loudest sound he would ever hear. Friday was coming, and there would be absolutely no mercy. I ended the call and rested the phone on the center console of my truck. The heavy silence of the parking garage wrapped around me, a stark contrast to the frantic, greedy energy that had just radiated from the speaker. Cameron had taken the bait with embarrassing speed. He was so desperate to save his sinking ship that he never stopped to ask why a man who had successfully defended a fortified cabin would suddenly break down and weep. Greed is a phenomenal anesthetic. It numbs the brain to logic, reason, and basic survival instincts. Natalie had laughed at my surrender. She had mocked my request for a simple apartment, demanding I be left with absolutely nothing. I let her cruel laughter echo in my mind. It was the perfect fuel. I opened the encrypted laptop resting on the passenger seat and connected it to a secure, untraceable mobile hotspot. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the truck cab. It was time to arm the snare. Wallace had his federal contacts waiting in the shadows, but they needed a legitimate real-time trigger to act without a prolonged grand jury subpoena. They needed a verifiable digital tripwire to justify freezing Cameron out of his own boardroom. Evelyn had left me the fortune, but she had also left me the precise instructions on how to weaponize it. I bypassed the primary $15 million offshore holding. I did not need the entire arsenal for this specific maneuver. I navigated to a secondary account, a small reserve of international bearer bonds tied directly to the tangled web of logistics accounts Cameron now technically controlled. I highlighted a specific cluster of these bonds. I initiated a liquidation and transfer of exactly $10,000. To the average person, $10,000 is simply a large sum of money. To a forensic accountant, it is a highly specific, legally volatile threshold. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, any transaction meeting this exact amount across international borders into a domestic corporate account triggers an automatic mandatory currency transaction report. But I did not just send the money. I routed the $10,000 through a flagged shell company that Cameron had used to embezzle funds 6 months ago. By forcing this specific amount of foreign capital into his corrupted domestic ledger, I was purposefully tripping an automated fraud alert within the Internal Revenue Service. The digital transfer complete bar filled the screen. The money moved through the transatlantic cables in a fraction of a second. Wallace had told me that the moment this specific alert registered in the federal system, his contacts in the Financial Crimes Division would have the immediate statutory authority to lock down every remaining line of credit Cameron possessed. The freeze would not happen today. The algorithm would process the anomaly, build the temporary injunction, and execute the total asset freeze on Friday, right in the middle of our scheduled meeting. Cameron would reach for the pen to steal my home completely unaware that his financial heart had just stopped beating. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully into the leather portfolio. The digital trap was permanently set. Now I had to prepare the physical presentation. I looked down at myself in the dim light of the truck cab. I was wearing a faded gray sweater, a pair of worn denim trousers, and scuffed utility boots. These were the clothes of a caregiver. These were the garments I had lived in for 3 years, while I slept on a narrow cot, monitored intravenous drips, and watched the love of my life slowly fade away. I looked like a victim. I looked exactly like the helpless, discarded old man Cameron firmly believed me to be. He had warned me not to embarrass him at the bank. He had told me to wear something presentable for his corporate associates. I fully intended to grant him that final wish. I put the truck into gear and drove out of the parking garage, merging into the heavy afternoon traffic of the financial district. I parked in front of a high-end menswear boutique that catered exclusively to the corporate elite. It was the kind of establishment where prices were not listed on the garments and appointments were strictly required. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The quiet hum of classical music and the rich scent of cedar and fine wool filled the air. A young, sharply dressed attendant stepped forward, his eyes immediately scanning my frayed sweater and scuffed boots. A polite but unmistakable look of dismissal crossed his face. He assumed I was lost. Before he could offer me a patronizing direction to the exit, I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out a solid black invitation-only corporate card linked to Evelyn's primary clean trust. I placed it quietly on the glass display counter. The attendant's eyes widened. The dismissal vanished, instantly replaced by the nervous, hurried deference that ultimate wealth always commands. "I need a bespoke fitting," I told him, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of warmth. "I require a charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. I need it tailored and ready to wear by tomorrow evening. Money is not a concern. Perfection is." The boutique manager was summoned immediately. For the next 2 hours, I stood in front of a three-way mirror in a private fitting room. The tailor measured every inch of my frame with meticulous precision. He brought out bolts of heavy, luxurious Italian wool. He selected a fabric that was dark as slate woven with a subtle razor-thin pinstripe. It was not a suit designed for a celebration. It was a garment designed for a boardroom execution. When I returned to the boutique late Thursday evening for the final fitting, the transformation was absolute. I stepped into the dressing room and put on the clothes. The heavily starched white shirt fit perfectly against my shoulders. The charcoal jacket draped flawlessly, broad and commanding, erasing any trace of the exhausted old man who had been thrown out into the gravel dirt just days prior. The dark silk tie was knotted perfectly at my throat. I slipped my feet into a pair of polished black leather Oxfords. I looked at my reflection in the tall mirror. The man staring back at me was no longer Evelyn's grieving husband. He was the apex predator of the financial world. He was the man who had dismantled corrupt empires and liquidated fraudulent corporations with ruthless mathematical precision. The $3,000 suit acted as a suit of armor. It projected absolute unyielding authority. Cameron expected a weeping broken peasant to shuffle into his bank and hand over the keys to a kingdom. Instead, he was going to face a king. I paid the $3,000 invoice without a single glance at the receipt. I instructed the attendant to throw my old clothes directly into the incinerator bin. I did not want to carry a single thread of my past weakness into the future. I walked out of the boutique and stepped into the cool night air of the city. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. Everything was finished. The offshore funds were liquidated and moving through the federal tripwires. Wallace's legal assassins were fully briefed and waiting in the wings. The digital dossier was loaded and aimed directly at the heart of Cameron's counterfeit empire. My armor was perfectly tailored. I walked back to my truck, my footsteps echoing loudly against the silent buildings. The snare was fully armed, the bait was swallowed, and the predator was waiting patiently in the dark. All that remained was the dawn. All that remained was Friday noon, the boardroom, and the final devastating drop of the guillotine. The air inside the elite downtown bank boardroom was perfectly climate-controlled, but it felt suffocatingly thin. I sat perfectly still at the far end of a massive polished mahogany table that stretched nearly 20 feet across the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline bathed in the pale gray light of a Friday afternoon. It was the exact kind of sterile, opulent environment designed to intimidate the weak and validate the powerful. But I was not intimidated. I felt the flawless drape of the charcoal wool suit I wore sitting against my shoulders like a suit of armor. I rested my hands flat on the cool wood. I was ready. Across the vast expanse of the table sat my son. Cameron wore a navy blue bespoke suit that probably cost more than my first car, but it could not hide the absolute terror radiating from his pores. He was trying to project the effortless dominance of a corporate titan, but 35 years of forensic auditing had taught me how to read the physical manifestations of financial ruin. I saw the faint sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. I watched his right knee bouncing rhythmically beneath the table, sending tiny vibrations up through the mahogany wood. He was a man drowning in invisible water, gasping for a lifeline he believed I was about to hand him. Beside him, Natalie was slouched in a plush leather chair, aggressively chewing a piece of mint gum. She held her smartphone delicately in her manicured hands, scrolling through social media feeds with an expression of toxic boredom. She refused to even look in my direction. To her, I was merely an administrative delay, a brief, annoying hurdle standing between her and her next luxury purchase. She had no idea that the credit cards resting inside her designer purse were currently being severed from the global financial network. At the far end of the room, near the heavy glass doors, sat a young notary public. She quietly organized her ink stamps and legal seals, completely oblivious to the massacre she was about to witness. The heavy silence stretched. Every tick of the expensive wall clock echoed like a hammer strike. I did not speak. I let the silence do the work. Silence is a predator that feeds on the guilty. The longer I sat there without uttering a single word, the more Cameron's fragile composure began to fracture. He shifted his weight, adjusting his silk tie with a trembling hand. He could not stand the quiet anymore. Cameron cleared his throat, a harsh and ugly sound in the pristine room. He reached down to his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped them onto the table and pushed them aggressively across the polished wood. The heavy paper slid smoothly, coming to a halt, exactly 2 inches from my fingertips. It was the irrevocable transfer of deed for the coastal property. The absolute surrender of my last remaining asset. Sign it, old man. Cameron sneered, his voice tight and breathless. I looked down at the documents, but I did not move my hands. I did not reach for the silver fountain pen resting beside the paper. I simply stared at the blank signature line, tracing the legal jargon with my eyes. We have generously arranged a cot for you at a state-run facility, Cameron continued, his tone dripping with a pathetic attempt at superiority. It is a very clean building. You will have 3 meals a day and people your own age to talk to. It is far more than you deserve after forcing us to drag you out of that miserable shack. But I am a forgiving man. Sign the papers, Gordon. The bank manager will be here in a moment to witness the transfer, and then you can go quietly. Natalie finally looked up from her glowing screen. She let out a short, cruel laugh that bounced sharply against the glass windows. You really should be thanking us, Gordon, she said, her voice laced with venom. We could have left you completely on the street after the stunt you pulled last night, locking our contractors out of the property. Cameron is being incredibly generous. A cot in a sterile room is a luxury right now. Just sign the stupid paper so we can liquidate that rotting pile of wood and get back to our actual lives. I kept my eyes fixed on the documents. I did not look at her. I did not look at him. I was calculating the exact moment the automated Internal Revenue Service algorithms were shutting down his corporate identity. The $10,000 offshore transfer I had executed the night before had successfully breached his domestic accounts, triggering the federal tripwires. Right now, in subterranean server farms across the country, his entire financial history was being permanently locked behind government encryption. Did you hear me? Cameron demanded, slamming his fist against the table. The sudden violent noise made the young notary jump in her seat. His panic was spilling over the edges of his tailored suit. I said, sign the document. I am out of patience. If you do not put your name on that line right this second, I will walk out of this room and I will call the medical authorities. I will tell them you are experiencing severe delusions. I will have a judge declare you mentally incompetent before the sun goes down, and I will take the property anyway. You have zero leverage here. You are nothing but a tired old man who does not know how the real world works. I slowly lifted my head. I met his gaze. I let him see the absolute coldness in my eyes. I let him see the man who had torn down corrupt executives and sent billionaires to federal prison. The sudden shift in my posture, the sheer lack of fear in my expression, caused Cameron to physically recoil. He blinked, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second, as his primitive survival instincts finally registered that something was terribly wrong. I am not going to sign anything, Cameron, I said, my voice low and perfectly even. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse, but the words never left his throat. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom suddenly clicked open. The sound was sharp and definitive, severing the tension in the room like a blade. Cameron snapped his head around, his eyes wide with furious indignation at the unauthorized interruption. We are in the middle of a private family legal matter, he barked at the doorway. I reserved this room for the entire hour. Get out. The doors swung wide open. Mr. Wallace stepped over the threshold. He wore a pristine black suit and carried a thick leather briefcase identical to the one I had left in his office the day before. His face was a mask of pure professional hostility. He did not look like a man who was lost or confused. He looked like an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. Behind him, the hallway was completely silent. The usual bustle of banking executives and loan officers had vanished. In their place stood two men wearing dark, nondescript suits. They stepped into the boardroom, flanking Mr. Wallace with quiet, practiced efficiency. They did not carry briefcases. They carried gold shields clipped to their leather belts. Federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. The temperature in the opulent boardroom seemed to plummet to absolute zero. The air grew impossibly heavy. The young notary at the end of the table stopped breathing, entirely pressing her back against her chair to make herself as small as possible. Natalie dropped her phone. The device hit the mahogany table with a loud crack, but she did not reach for it. She stared at the federal badges, her mouth slightly open, the color rapidly draining from her face. Cameron stood up so fast his leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. His hands were trembling violently. He looked at Mr. Wallace, then at the federal agents, and finally his eyes snapped back to me. The aggressive predator who had just threatened to throw me into a state ward was instantly replaced by a terrified, confused boy. He could not comprehend how the helpless old man he had bullied for 3 years had suddenly summoned a federal strike team into his private sanctuary. The trap had closed. There was nowhere left to run. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom slid shut behind the two federal agents, sealing the room like a polished mahogany tomb. The air inside the elite downtown bank was perfectly climate-controlled, but it suddenly felt impossibly thin. Cameron stood frozen behind his plush leather chair, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the abrupt shift in his reality. He looked at the gold federal badges gleaming against the dark suits of the agents, and then his eyes darted to Thomas Wallace. Wallace did not offer a polite greeting. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who held the absolute power of ruin in his hands. He stepped up to the massive table and dropped his thick leather portfolio onto its reflective surface. The heavy thud echoed through the silent room, vibrating against the expensive wood and shattering the arrogant illusion Cameron had spent the last hour constructing. Cameron stammered loudly, demanding to know what was happening. He pointed a trembling finger at me, telling Wallace that this was a private family meeting and that I was simply there to sign over the deed to the coastal property. He ordered the agents to leave his sanctuary immediately. Wallace did not even look at the stack of fraudulent documents Cameron had pushed across the table. He simply opened his leather portfolio and extracted a single crisp manila folder. Wallace spoke with a voice perfectly calibrated to project absolute unyielding authority. He informed Cameron that the documents sitting on the table were legally worthless pieces of paper. He explained that my late wife, Evelyn, was a woman of extraordinary intellect and foresight. She knew her son possessed a dangerous and insatiable appetite for unearned wealth. Wallace stated clearly that the coastal cabin, the specific property Cameron was so desperate to liquidate to save his own sinking ship, did not belong to me. It never had. Cameron stared at Wallace in blind confusion. He aggressively insisted that the estate passed to the surviving spouse upon Evelyn's death. He claimed he had audited the preliminary filings himself and knew his legal rights. Wallace allowed a cold, sharp smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He explained that the preliminary filings were merely a diversion designed to keep greedy eyes looking in the wrong direction. The exact moment Evelyn drew her last breath, the coastal property was automatically transferred into an irrevocable blind trust. The trust was entirely insulated from any civil, domestic, or corporate claims. Wallace looked directly into Cameron's panicked eyes and delivered the fatal legal blow. He told him that I was merely the appointed trustee of the estate. I possessed absolutely no legal authority to sell, transfer, or liquidate the asset under any circumstances. Even if I had signed the desperate papers Cameron had placed in front of me, the signature would be completely void. Cameron could not touch the cabin. His final imaginary lifeline had just been severed. Natalie let out a sharp gasp, gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her face shifted to a sickly shade of gray as the reality of their financial doom finally penetrated her thick layers of entitlement. She looked at Cameron, demanding that he do something, demanding that he call his own lawyers and fix the disaster unfolding in front of them. But Cameron had nothing left to say. His knees buckled slightly, and he collapsed back into his chair, staring blankly at the worthless deed sitting on the table. The silence returned heavier and more suffocating than before. I had sat perfectly still throughout Wallace's presentation, allowing the formidable legal machinery to break my son's initial defenses. Now it was my turn to complete the excision. I slowly lifted my hands from the table. I completely ignored the fraudulent deed Cameron had demanded I sign. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and withdrew a single folded piece of paper. I smoothed the paper flat against the mahogany wood. The crisp sound of the heavy stock paper sliding across the table was the only noise in the room. I pushed it directly toward Cameron. It stopped resting right over his fraudulent deed. Cameron looked down at the paper. His eyes frantically scanned the columns of numbers, the highlighted routing digits, and the specific dates meticulously logged next to each offshore transaction. I watched the remaining blood drain entirely from his face. His hands began to shake so violently that he had to press them flat against his thighs just to hide the tremors from the room. I told him that the paper was a consolidated ledger. I kept my voice incredibly low, forcing him to lean forward and listen closely to the mechanics of his own destruction. I explained that it detailed every phantom vendor payout, every drained pension reserve, and every forged corporate loan he had executed over the past 5 years. I told him the total was exactly $2.4 million stolen directly from his mother's logistics company. Cameron tried to speak, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He let out a pathetic, wheezing sound, shaking his head in a futile attempt at denial. He tried to claim the transfers were authorized business expenses, that his mother had approved the aggressive restructuring of the corporate accounts before she got sick. I did not let him finish the pathetic lie. I cut him off sharply, stating that every single transaction had been traced directly to the Internet protocol addresses of his personal devices. I told him we had the digital logs proving he had forged Evelyn's credentials while she was heavily medicated and fighting for her life in a hospital bed. I looked at the 2 federal agents standing quietly by the door. I told Cameron they were not here to observe a simple real estate transfer. They were here because the ledger sitting in front of him constituted massive, undeniable federal wire fraud. Natalie began to hyperventilate. She pushed her chair away from the table, creating immediate physical distance between herself and her husband, as if his financial crimes were a contagious disease. She pointed a shaking finger at Cameron and frantically declared to the federal agents that she knew absolutely nothing about the stolen money. She insisted she had no part in managing the corporate accounts and was completely innocent. The fierce loyalty she had feigned for years vanished in a single instant, replaced by the raw, desperate animal instinct to save herself from federal prison. Cameron did not even look at her. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike his throat. He finally looked up at me. His eyes were wide and brimming with unshed tears of absolute terror. He asked me why I was doing this to him. He asked how a father could destroy his own son without a second thought. He pleaded with me, telling me we were blood and that family was supposed to protect each other. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold mahogany. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy who had actively chosen relentless greed over basic human decency. I told him he had destroyed himself. I explained that Evelyn knew about the missing money months before she passed away. She had seen the glaring discrepancies in the quarterly financial reports, but she did not want to believe her own flesh and blood was bleeding her life's work dry. She needed to know the absolute truth about his character before she finalized her legacy. I told Cameron that the entire inheritance structure was completely by design. The sprawling villa in Italy, the toxic corporate liabilities, the frozen international accounts. None of it was a tragic accident or a legal oversight. It was a carefully constructed mechanism designed to strip away his illusions. I watched his eyes widen as the profound depth of his mother's brilliant orchestration finally became clear to him. The villa in Italy was a stress test. Cameron, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, and delivering the words with the devastating precision of a surgeon. A test to see if you would care for me or discard me. You failed. Cameron let out a broken, ragged sob, burying his face in his trembling hands. The grand illusion of the powerful corporate titan was completely shattered, leaving only a terrified, ruined thief facing the absolute certainty of a federal indictment. He had fully expected me to be a weak, isolated victim, begging for scraps at his table. He never realized that my quiet demeanor over the past 3 years was not submission. It was meticulous observation. It was the gathering of undeniable ammunition. You failed your mother, and you failed me, I said, the finality of the words ringing like a heavy gavel, dropping in an empty courtroom. You sent armed men to my door to throw me out into the freezing rain because you thought my physical safety was worth 20% of a real estate commission. You sold your soul for a counterfeit luxury lifestyle that was built entirely on theft, and now the bill has finally come due. Wallace stepped forward, signaling the federal agents with a slight nod of his head. The two men moved silently across the room, their heavy footsteps echoing ominously on the polished marble floor. They flanked Cameron's chair, their expressions completely devoid of any sympathy. The lead agent instructed Cameron to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs engaging was the loudest and most definitive sound in the entire building. I stood up from my chair, buttoning the jacket of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not look back at my son as the agents pulled him roughly to his feet. I did not look at Natalie, who was sobbing quietly in the corner, desperately trying to scroll through her phone to find a defense attorney who would inevitably demand a massive retainer she no longer possessed. I picked up the single piece of paper, the irrefutable ledger of his sins, and placed it carefully back into my breast pocket. The natural order had been restored. The parasite had been surgically excised, and the long silent work of protecting Evelyn's legacy was finally complete. The shock paralyzing the room was absolute and profound. The two federal agents stood perfectly still like statues carved from retribution, while Cameron stared at them in mute horror. Before my son could command his vocal cords to form a single coherent word, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom slid open again. This time it was Mr. Harrison, the senior branch manager of the bank. He was a man who usually moved with the smooth, arrogant glide of old money, but today he was sweating profusely. He clutched a sleek digital tablet to his chest, as if it were a protective shield. He did not look at Cameron with the usual deference he reserved for his wealthy elite clients. Instead, he looked at the federal agents with absolute, unwavering submission. Harrison cleared his throat loudly, and his voice trembled as he announced that he had just received a mandatory federal directive. He stated that the automated fraud alerts triggered by an offshore anomaly had authorized the immediate freezing of all domestic accounts associated with Cameron and Natalie. Every credit line, every checking account, every hidden corporate reserve was completely and irrevocably locked down. Harrison explained that his hands were tied by federal statutes, and the bank could no longer offer them any financial services or legal protections. He apologized to the federal agents for the disturbance in his branch, but he offered absolutely no comfort to the man sitting across from me. Natalie heard the manager's words, but her mind completely refused to accept the reality of her sudden absolute poverty. She frantically snatched her dropped smartphone from the polished mahogany table and began tapping the screen with desperate, aggressive movements. The heavy silence in the room amplified the frantic clicking of her manicured fingernails against the glass display. She was trying to access her private banking applications, trying to move liquid money into untraceable digital wallets before the federal net closed completely around them. But the net was already drawn incredibly tight. I watched her pristine face contort into a mask of pure feral terror as screen after screen flashed red access denied warnings. The digital lifeblood that funded her designer clothes, her luxury cars, and her false sense of superiority was entirely gone. Natalie let out a sudden sharp sound that was half sob and half scream. She turned toward Cameron, her eyes wide with a vicious animal panic. She demanded to know what he had done. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that he had promised her the coastal property was going to save them, that the old man was a helpless fool who would sign away his life without a single fight. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the federal agents standing by the door and screamed that she was not going to a federal penitentiary simply because her husband was too incredibly stupid to properly embezzle money from his own dying mother. She did not care about the legal exposure of her words. Greed had bound them together, and the sudden evaporation of that wealth was tearing them apart with spectacular violence. Natalie loudly declared to the room that she had never touched the corporate ledgers, that she had begged Cameron not to forge Evelyn's signature, that she was merely an innocent bystander trapped in his massive web of financial deceit. It was a pathetic, desperate lie, and every single person standing in the boardroom knew it, but it served its intended purpose. It completely shattered Cameron's mind. The man who had spent his entire adult life projecting the flawless image of an untouchable corporate titan suddenly realized he was absolutely nothing. His mother had anticipated his treachery long before her death. His father had orchestrated his total ruin without ever raising his voice. His wife was eagerly feeding him to the federal wolves just to save her own skin. The bank manager he considered a subordinate had locked him out of his own financial kingdom. He had absolutely nothing left in the world. Cameron slowly turned his head to look at me sitting calmly at the far end of the massive table in my flawless charcoal suit. He saw the cold, clinical satisfaction in my eyes. He saw the immovable architecture of the trap I had built for him. His panic rapidly mutated into a blind, violent, and unhinged rage. The illusion of his sophistication vanished, leaving only a raw, primitive fury. Cameron let out a guttural, roaring scream that tore from the very bottom of his lungs. He did not care about the federal agents. He did not care about Mr. Wallace or the terrified notary who had backed herself flat against the far wall. He cared only about destroying the man who had exposed his profound, fundamental weakness. Cameron lunged across the wide mahogany table. His polished leather shoes slipped wildly against the floorboards as he scrambled over the scattered, fraudulent deeds, knocking the silver fountain pen onto the hard marble tile. He stretched his long arms out his hands, forming desperate, violent claws aimed directly at my throat. He wanted to drag me down into the abyss right alongside him. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I simply sat back in my heavy leather chair and watched the natural physical consequences of his actions unfold before my eyes. Before Cameron could cross even half the distance of the massive table, the two federal agents moved with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency. They were professionals trained to neutralize sudden violence, and my son was moving entirely on blind emotion. The lead agent stepped forward and grabbed Cameron firmly by the collar of his expensive bespoke suit, violently jerking him backward. Cameron's forward momentum was instantly reversed, suspending him in the air for a fraction of a second. The second agent swept his legs out from under him, and my son crashed down onto the hard marble floor with a sickening hollow thud. The violent impact drove all the air from his lungs, completely replacing his furious roar with a pathetic, wheezing gasp. The agents did not hesitate to secure the threat. They dropped their heavy knees forcefully into Cameron's back, pinning him completely flat against the cold stone floor. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the sterile air of the boardroom as they pulled his arms back and locked his wrists tightly behind him. Cameron struggled weakly against the restraints, but the fight had been entirely knocked out of him. Natalie backed away until she hit the glass windows, covering her mouth with her hands, completely paralyzed by the sudden physical violence that had invaded her pristine world. Mr. Wallace stood perfectly still, observing the takedown, with the detached, quiet satisfaction of a predator watching a highly successful hunt. Mr. Harrison, the bank manager, had retreated entirely into the hallway, terrified of the legal consequences spilling into his perfect bank. I looked down at my son. His cheek was pressed hard against the floor, his tailored suit ruined and dusty, his entire future completely erased. He was gasping for air, while tears of physical pain and absolute psychological defeat streamed continuously down his face. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes begging for a mercy he had never once offered to anyone else. I offered him nothing but silence. The excision was complete. The infection had been permanently removed from Evelyn's legacy, and the natural order had been flawlessly restored. I slowly stood up from the mahogany table, adjusting the crisp cuffs of my tailored suit. I picked up the leather portfolio containing the unblemished truth of my wife's empire. I did not say goodbye. I simply turned and prepared to walk out of the glass building, leaving my son on the floor to face the exact, miserable destiny he had so greedily chosen for himself. The polished marble floor of the boardroom offered absolutely no traction as the federal agents hauled my son to his feet. Cameron was a dead weight, a hollowed-out shell of a man who had finally collided with the absolute limits of his own towering arrogance. His expensive navy blue bespoke suit was wrinkled and stained with the pale dust of the floorboards. His custom silk tie hung loose and crooked around his neck, making him look like a broken child rather than the corporate titan he had pretended to be just moments earlier. The steel handcuffs clicked with a sharp mechanical finality that echoed violently off the panoramic glass walls. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table and watched the precise execution of the trap I had spent the entire night building. Cameron dragged his heavy leather shoes across the marble as the agents turned him toward the heavy frosted doors. He did not attempt to fight them. The aggressive predator, who had threatened to lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward, was entirely gone, erased by the devastating reality of his federal indictment. He twisted his neck to look over his shoulder, casting one final desperate glance in my direction. His eyes were red and wide, pooling with tears of absolute terror and disbelief. He was waiting for me to stand up and intervene. He was waiting for his father to shield him from the consequences of his own crimes, just as I had done when he was a careless boy making mistakes. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. I let him look into my eyes and see the vast, impenetrable silence of a man who had just surgically excised a parasite from his life. The agents pushed him firmly through the doorway, and the heavy glass sealed shut behind him, cutting off his erratic breathing and removing his physical presence from my world forever. The silence that returned to the boardroom was absolute and crushing, pressing down on the remaining occupants with the weight of a collapsing building. The air felt sterile and bitterly cold. Thomas Wallace stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his face an unreadable mask of ruthless corporate efficiency. He had orchestrated the legal destruction with flawless precision, and now he was simply observing the residual fallout. My attention shifted down the long expanse of the polished wooden table to the woman crumpled on the floor. Natalie was completely paralyzed by the sudden violence of her new reality. The arrogant smirk that had defined her entire existence for the past 3 years had been violently wiped from her face. Her breathing was shallow and frantic, rattling in her chest like a trapped bird. She pushed herself into the far corner of the room, pressing her back against the expensive wood paneling, as if trying to merge with the architecture and disappear from the sight of the remaining federal agent who had stayed behind to secure the scene. The agent walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, his face showing absolutely no sympathy for her manufactured distress. He looked down at the designer purse resting on the thick carpet near her trembling hands. It was a rare imported leather bag that she had purchased just 2 months ago using a credit card fraudulently opened under my name. The agent reached down and picked it up by the strap. Natalie gasped audibly, reaching out a shaking hand to stop him, but her manicured fingers merely swatted the empty air. She stammered out a weak, terrified protest, claiming the bag belonged to her and that it contained her personal property. The federal agent informed her in a flat and unyielding monotone voice that every single asset purchased with stolen corporate funds was now officially classified as federal evidence. He told her that the platinum credit cards inside the purse, the electronic keys to the luxury vehicles parked downstairs, and the expensive smartphone she had dropped on the table were all being permanently confiscated under the ongoing criminal fraud investigation. He zipped a thick plastic evidence tag over the leather handle, and stepped away, leaving her sitting on the floor with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. I watched her mind struggle to process the profound magnitude of her sudden and absolute poverty. For years, she had floated effortlessly through life, resting on a comfortable cushion of unearned wealth. She had actively encouraged Cameron to bleed Evelyn's logistics company dry, whispering poison into his ear while he forged digital signatures. She had laughed openly at my supposed helplessness. She had mocked the idea of me living in a rotting coastal cabin and eagerly endorsed the plan to throw me into a miserable state facility so they could liquidate my sanctuary. She truly believed that her elevated status was permanent and that her cruelty was completely immune to retribution. Now the invisible cushion was entirely gone. The bank manager had frozen her domestic accounts in real time. The federal government had seized her stolen properties. Her husband was currently on his way to a holding cell in a secure transport vehicle. The immense, crushing weight of total financial ruin came crashing down on her narrow shoulders, pressing her chest toward the floor until she was weeping uncontrollably into her trembling hands. Natalie slowly lifted her head from the carpet. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, smeared in dark, heavy streaks across her pale cheeks. She looked at the vacant leather chair where her husband had been sitting just moments before, and then her eyes slowly tracked across the 20 feet of polished mahogany until they finally met mine. The sheer desperation in her gaze was feral and raw. She dragged herself onto her knees, pulling her body forward until she was clutching the smooth edge of the heavy table. She begged me to help her. Her voice was a pathetic whining rasp, entirely stripped of all its former haughty pride. She told me she had no money to pay for a taxi back to her estate. She sobbed that she had absolutely no access to her bank accounts and nowhere to sleep tonight. She claimed she had been manipulated by Cameron and that she had never wanted to hurt me. She spun a frantic lie, insisting that she was merely an innocent victim of his toxic corporate ambitions and that she had always respected my position in the family. She begged me for mercy, telling me that we were family and that I could not possibly leave her here alone with absolutely nothing. I listened to her desperate weeping without a single flicker of empathy warming my chest. My mind flashed back to the audio recording I had captured the night before while sitting in the dark cab of my truck. I remembered the exact pitch of her cruel laughter when she told Cameron not to give me a single dime more than the bare minimum required to keep me locked in a sterile medical room. I remembered how she used to complain about the smell of antiseptic when she briefly visited Evelyn's hospice room, acting as if my dying wife was a profound inconvenience to her social schedule. I remembered how eagerly she had anticipated my absolute misery and how quickly she had planned to spend the money they intended to steal from my eviction. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair at the head of the boardroom table. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit, ensuring the dark, heavy wool draped perfectly across my broad shoulders. I reached down and adjusted the crisp white cuffs of my shirt, making sure they extended precisely a 1/4 inch past the sleeves of my suit jacket. I picked up the leather portfolio containing the unblemished truth of Evelyn's restored legacy and tucked it securely under my arm. I looked down the long, reflective length of the table at the weeping woman kneeling on the floor. I told her that she had exactly what she had earned. I told her I suggested she find a spot to rest. I turned my back on her and began to walk away. My polished black leather Oxfords clicked against the marble floor, executing a steady, rhythmic cadence of absolute finality. I did not walk with the hurried, frantic pace of a man fleeing a violent crime scene. I walked with the measured, confident stride of a man who had successfully concluded a highly complex and deeply personal audit. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom. Mr. Wallace stepped aside to let me pass, dipping his chin in a silent, respectful gesture, acknowledging the flawless execution of our shared strategy. The remaining federal agent opened the door for me, his face completely neutral as I stepped through the threshold. I left the suffocating atmosphere of the executive suite behind me and walked out into the wide, brightly lit corridor of the financial institution. The bank lobby below was a cavernous space constructed of glass and steel, acting as a towering monument to modern capital. Looking over the balcony, I could see tellers processing mundane transactions for ordinary citizens, while armed security guards stood watch near the revolving doors. Nobody in the sprawling building had any idea that a multi-million-dollar criminal empire had just been surgically dismantled on the very top floor. They did not know that a parasitic heir was currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle facing decades in prison, or that his complicit greedy wife was weeping on the floor of a locked room without a single dollar to her name. The world continued to turn completely indifferent to the total destruction of Cameron and Natalie. It was the exact kind of quiet, invisible justice that Evelyn had always preferred, and I had delivered it flawlessly. I walked toward the bank of polished steel elevators, pressing the call button with a remarkably steady hand. The metallic chime signaled the arrival of the car. The heavy doors slid open, and I stepped inside, pressing the glowing button for the subterranean parking garage. As the elevator descended rapidly through the concrete core of the skyscraper, I felt a profound sense of equilibrium finally settle deep into my bones. The heavy, oppressive weight I had carried for 3 past years, the agonizing burden of watching my son exploit his mother's terminal illness, was completely eradicated. I had allowed him every possible opportunity to prove he possessed a single shred of human decency. I had presented him with the ultimate stress test, offering him my feigned vulnerability to see if he would protect his father or destroy him for a quick profit. He had actively chosen destruction, and in doing so, he had willingly authorized his own permanent removal from my life. The elevator doors opened into the dim, cool air of the underground garage. I walked across the gray concrete floor toward my truck. The vehicle looked entirely out of place among the rows of sleek, imported luxury sedans that belonged to the banking executives. It was a sturdy, unassuming machine built for endurance rather than shallow display. It perfectly mirrored the man I truly was beneath the expensive tailoring of my new suit. I unlocked the heavy metal door and climbed into the cab, tossing the leather portfolio onto the passenger seat next to my encrypted laptop. I inserted the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life, wrapping me in its familiar, reliable rumble. I put the truck into gear and drove up the concrete ramp, emerging back into the gray afternoon light of the busy city. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the downtown streets slick and highly reflective. I navigated through the dense traffic, steering toward the northbound highway that would eventually take me back to the isolated coast. The thick titanium shutters of my cabin were waiting to be opened, and the ocean air was waiting to clear my lungs. The reinforced steel door stood unbreached, and the fortress Evelyn had designed for me was completely secure. The ledger of my son's sins was closed forever, and the toxic chapter of his greed was permanently concluded. I did not feel the need to celebrate or gloat over my victory. The silent reckoning was never about petty vengeance or dramatic anger. It was always about the cold, necessary arithmetic of survival and the preservation of truth. I had balanced the scales perfectly. I had excised the rot from our bloodline. I merged onto the fast lane of the interstate, leaving the towering glass structures of the financial district far behind me, watching them fade into the rearview mirror like a terrible nightmare that had finally come to an end. The tires of the heavy truck hummed a steady low rhythm against the wet asphalt as I navigated the winding exit ramp out of the subterranean parking garage. I emerged from the concrete depths and merged into the dense, sluggish traffic of the financial district. I watched the towering glass monoliths fade slowly in the rearview mirror. They were massive, shining monuments to unbridled greed and corporate ambition shrines where men like my son worshipped the illusion of infinite power and untouchable status. Cameron was physically trapped within those transparent walls, now processing the devastating reality of a cage he had meticulously built with his own 2 hands. Natalie was likely still weeping on the polished marble floor, completely paralyzed by the sudden and violent evaporation of her counterfeit luxury. I felt the crisp, stiff collar of the bespoke charcoal suit pressing against my neck. The expensive wool had served its purpose, perfectly functioning as an impenetrable armor of authority that had completely shattered my son's arrogant perception of my vulnerability. I reached up and slowly loosened the dark silk tie, pulling it free from my collar and tossing it onto the passenger seat next to the heavy leather portfolio. The rigid formality of the corporate executioner began to slip away, replaced by a profound and heavy exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. The sprawling concrete arteries of the city slowly surrendered to the rugged, untamed beauty of the coastal highway. The dense traffic thinned out, leaving only the open road and the vast, restless expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretching out beside me. The storm clouds that had choked the sky for days, dumping freezing rain over the coastline, were finally breaking apart and retreating toward the horizon. They made way for the descending sun, which cast a brilliant piercing gold across the cresting waves. The light turned the ocean into a magnificent mirror of molten fire, blinding and beautiful. The rhythmic thrum of the truck engine felt like a strong, steady heartbeat, completely unyielding and perfectly calm. For 3 long, agonizing years, my own heartbeat had felt muffled and suppressed, buried beneath the heavy, suffocating blanket of Evelyn's terminal illness and the exhausting performance I had to maintain for our completely ungrateful son. I had lived every single day walking on eggshells, pretending to be a frail, confused old man who was entirely dependent on the scraps of attention Cameron threw my way. Today, the air in the cab of the truck felt incredibly clean and pure. The oppressive, heavy weight of anticipating his ultimate betrayal was entirely gone, replaced by the profound crystal clarity of absolute consequence. I drove through the winding coastal curves, letting the golden hour sunlight warm the side of my face. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, guiding the heavy vehicle with practiced ease. I thought about the absolute, unadulterated terror in Cameron's eyes when the federal agents had violently pinned him to the marble floor of the boardroom. I searched my heart for a single ounce of paternal guilt or regret, but I found absolutely nothing. Greed is a highly corrosive acid that eats away the very foundation of human decency, and my son had willingly allowed it to consume his entire soul. He had looked up at me from the floor, expecting miraculous salvation, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that just days prior, he had happily authorized armed thugs to drag me out of my home into the freezing rain. He truly believed that family was a unilateral contract, a convenient shield he could wield to avoid the consequences of his own monstrous actions while simultaneously exploiting the people who loved him. I had not destroyed him. I had simply balanced the arithmetic of his life, bringing the ledgers of his morality into perfect harmony. Evelyn had known this day would come with absolute certainty. Even as her physical body failed her, wasting away in the quiet, sterile room of our home, her mind remained an impenetrable fortress of logic, foresight, and brilliant strategy. She knew Cameron would view her impending death not as a profound human tragedy, but as an incredibly lucrative opportunity for unchecked extraction. She had meticulously designed the blind trust, the toxic Italian estate liabilities, and the hidden bond triggers with the precision of a master watchmaker. She left me as the silent architect of her final devastating lesson. She knew I had the infinite patience to endure his insults, his condescension, and his pathetic attempts at dominance. She knew I possessed the iron will required to drop the blade precisely when the time was right. We had spent decades building a life of quiet dignity, and she refused to let a parasite drain the blood from her legacy simply because he shared her genetic material. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, turning the sky into a violent canvas of deep purple and burnt orange as the familiar towering pine forests rose up to greet me. The heavy gravel of the long driveway crunched loudly beneath the tires, a sound that usually signaled deep isolation, but tonight it signaled absolute total victory. I parked the truck near the shattered, twisted remnants of the iron gate at the bottom of the property line. The ruined metal was a physical, lingering testament to Cameron's desperate, primitive brutality. It stood as a stark, beautiful contrast to the elegant, devastating legality of the invisible trap that had just ruined his entire existence. I opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, letting the cool evening ocean breeze wash completely over my face. The salty air carried the rich, earthy scent of damp pine needles and sea spray, instantly cleansing the sterile, artificial stench of the bank boardroom from my senses. The cabin stood before me completely silent and perfectly secure behind its deployed titanium shutters. It looked like a subterranean military bunker, a quiet, immovable monolith that had weathered a violent, chaotic siege and emerged without a single scratch or dent. I walked slowly up the wooden steps of the front porch, the heavy leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm. I bypassed the fortified steel entry door that the thugs had uselessly battered with their sledgehammers and moved toward the concealed secondary access panel built seamlessly into the rotting cedar facade. I placed my hand on the scanner, entering the complex biometric sequence. I felt the heavy mechanical locking bolts disengage deep within the walls with a satisfying resonant thud. The reinforced exterior panels slid open smoothly, revealing the dimly lit corridor that led directly down into the subterranean vault. I stepped inside the passageway, the atmosphere instantly shifting from the wild, chaotic energy of the coastal wind to the absolute climate-controlled stillness of my hidden sanctuary. The automated lighting flickered to life sequentially as I walked, casting a warm amber glow over the expensive leather chairs, the massive steel desk, and the bank of dormant security monitors lining the far wall. I approached the heavy oak door that secured the inner sanctum of the vault. It was a beautiful, incredibly solid piece of timber that Evelyn had salvaged from a sunken galleon many years ago. She had always loved it, as a daily reminder that true unyielding strength often lies hidden far beneath the surface, waiting patiently to be discovered. I turned the cold brass handle and pushed the heavy oak open, the massive hinges gliding silently without a single creak. The room was exactly as I had left it in the early hours of the morning. The dedicated digital decryption terminal sat quietly on the corner of the steel desk, its ruthless work completely finished. The sprawling, complicated network of Cameron's fraudulent corporate empire had been permanently and irreversibly severed. The monitors were now dark, blank, and completely peaceful, reflecting nothing but the quiet shadows of the room. I placed the leather portfolio gently onto the center of the desk, letting my hand rest flat on the smooth surface for a long, uninterrupted moment. Inside that heavy folder was the absolute legacy of my wife's brilliant genius and the undeniable concrete proof of my son's total ruin. It was over. The leeches had been surgically, flawlessly excised from the body of our family. The vast fortune Evelyn had spent her life building was completely insulated, entirely safe from the parasitic, grasping hands of a boy who understood the exact price of everything but the true inherent value of absolutely nothing. I walked slowly over to the small crystal decanter resting on the polished mahogany side table in the corner of the vault. The rich amber liquid caught the ambient overhead light, glowing with a warm, deep intensity that felt incredibly inviting after the sterile coldness of the city. I removed the heavy glass stopper and poured a single generous measure of the aged bourbon into a heavy crystal tumbler. The sound of the liquid splashing gently against the glass echoed perfectly in the quiet, insulated room. I picked up the tumbler, feeling its solid, comforting weight anchor me to the present moment. I turned back toward the large steel desk, my eyes immediately settling on the silver-framed photograph of Evelyn resting near the keyboard. She was smiling in the picture, a brilliant, knowing, and radiant smile captured years before the terrible illness began to slowly steal her away from me. Her bright eyes held that same sharp, undeniable intelligence that had orchestrated the ultimate airtight defense of our family. She looked exactly like the woman who had taught me how to fight monsters by simply letting them destroy themselves with their own insatiable appetites. I stood in front of the desk and raised the glass of bourbon, slowly holding it up toward her image in the quiet, undisturbed air. I did not speak a single word out loud. There were absolutely no words left to say. The profound silence of the vault was no longer a heavy, burdensome cloak of painful anticipation or suffocating grief. It was a clean, vast, and expansive emptiness. It was the beautiful sound of absolute equilibrium. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, letting the smooth, rich heat burn pleasantly down my throat and settle warmly into my chest. The digital fortress was perfectly secure. The long, silent war was decisively, permanently won. And for the first time in 3 incredibly long, agonizing years, the silence was finally truly my own. Greed is a profound blindness that prevents individuals from recognizing the boundary between entitlement and self-destruction. When people view family solely as a resource to be exploited, they inevitably dismantle the very foundation that supports them, leaving themselves isolated and vulnerable when the illusion of their power inevitably collapses. True wealth is not measured by stolen assets or unearned status, but by the quiet, enduring integrity of one's actions and the unwavering respect for those who sacrificed to build the legacy in the first place. Protect your peace and build your boundaries with absolute, unwavering resolve so that no parasite can ever drain the value of your hard-earned life.